"So what's a guy like you doing in a car like that?" The question wasn't curious. It was coded in suspicion. The kind of suspicion that didn't wait for context. Came preloaded with assumption. A state trooper's voice. Flat, rehearsed, laced with a smile that wasn't warm at all. The type that made it clear, you don't belong here. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in the world, hit that subscribe button to support us. It was just after 10 a.m. on a quiet stretch of I-96 in southern Michigan when Elias Dorsey pulled his black Lincoln into a rest area nestled between a line of bare trees and windswept concrete. The early spring sun was still weak, casting long shadows across the parking lot as he shifted into park and cut the engine. The man behind the wheel was not remarkable to passersby. A black man in his late 50s, tall, clean-shaven, sharply dressed in a slate-gray suit and powder blue shirt. His leather shoes matched the neat briefcase on the passenger seat, and everything about him spoke of discipline, order, and quiet strength. Elias wasn't rushing. He had time. In 2 hours, he would be sitting across from Michigan's governor at a roundtable on judicial reform. Elias Dorsey had spent over 2 decades as a district court judge. He'd presided over thousands of cases, mentored young lawyers, comforted grieving victims, and reprimanded power when it overstepped. He was respected not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. Still, that morning, none of it mattered, because someone saw something else. Not the resume, not the experience, just the color of the man in the car. A state police cruiser pulled into the lot moments later. It idled behind Elias's Lincoln with red and blue lights flickering against the asphalt. Inside sat Officer Travis Harlan, a young white patrolman who had been on the force for under 5 years. From his vantage point, Elias was a silhouette. A man alone in an expensive vehicle, engine running, head slightly bowed, looking down at his phone. Suspicion bloomed. No report had come in. No tip-off. Just instinct, the kind shaped more by bias than training. Officer Harlan called in his location and claimed he had spotted a vehicle matching a stolen car report. The report didn't exist, not really, but the story gave him cover. Without waiting for backup, he stepped out. Elias looked up as the officer approached. He lowered his window, hands in plain view, his voice calm, greeting the officer as any law-abiding citizen might. But calm only goes so far when your presence alone is perceived as provocation. Harlan didn't answer his greeting. Instead, he asked for license and registration with a tone that made the exchange feel like a warning, not a formality. When Elias explained he could retrieve the documents from his glove box, Harlan took a step back and placed his hand near his holstered weapon. His command came swiftly. "Exit the vehicle." Elias obeyed, not because he feared guilt, but because he knew how quickly dignity could become danger. The law, after all, didn't always protect those who upheld it. By the time the second officer, Officer Reams, arrived, Elias was already standing behind his vehicle, hands visible, posture erect. Officer Reams, a young white woman still early in her career, looked uncertain but said nothing. The questions weren't questions at all. They were accusations disguised as procedure. Why was he parked here? Why was the engine running? Where was he going dressed like that? Elias explained. A judicial reform session in Lansing. Directions on his phone. A stop to gather his thoughts. It didn't matter. The moment Officer Harlan leaned into the vehicle, uninvited, and opened Elias's glove compartment, it was clear this wasn't about a stolen car anymore. It wasn't even about suspicion. It was about power. Elias objected, calmly and firmly. He stated he did not consent to a search. He reminded the officer of his rights and his own. That was the moment it snapped. Obstruction. The word hung heavy in the air, absurd and convenient. Before Elias could utter another word, his arm was grabbed, twisted, cuffed. Officer Reams moved to secure the other wrist, her eyes avoiding his. He didn't resist. He didn't plead. He simply spoke 6 words. Not loudly, not threateningly. "You're making a serious mistake." People had begun to notice. A retired Navy man, walking his dog, paused mid-step. A college student, sipping gas station coffee, pulled out her phone and began recording. The scene played out in silence except for the murmur of disbelief from bystanders. What they saw wasn't a criminal. It was a man being reduced. A man who had done nothing. Elias was walked, no, paraded, to the cruiser as if his silence made him dangerous. But there was no aggression in him. No rage. Only a quiet disbelief that all his years in the system still couldn't shield him from its broken machinery. He sat in the back of the police car, wrists red, gaze distant. His mind wasn't racing. It was filing, documenting. He wasn't just a victim in that moment. He was a witness, a judge once again collecting evidence. Only this time from inside the story. Inside the precinct, the disrespect continued. He was denied his phone, denied a call. His name, Elias Dorsey, was entered without a second glance. No one connected the dots. No one paused long enough to consider that perhaps they weren't booking a suspect but humiliating an official whose courtroom they could one day stand in. Officers smirked behind desks. Someone muttered, "Thinks he's somebody." As if confidence in your rights was arrogance. As if dressing well was performance. 2 hours passed. 3. Still no call. Still no recognition. Just a man in a suit, sitting quietly under fluorescent lights, waiting for the system to trip over its own arrogance. But something was shifting, because Judge Elias Dorsey knew something the others didn't. This story wasn't ending here. It was just beginning. The chill inside the holding area wasn't just from the air conditioning. It came from the posture, the silence, the way people moved around Elias without looking directly at him. A quiet coldness. The kind that crept in slowly when people decided they no longer needed to acknowledge your humanity. He sat on a hard plastic bench, wrists free now but marked from the cuffs, 2 shallow red rings that throbbed with a dull ache. His suit jacket had been draped across the back of a chair, creased in a way that irritated him not because of vanity but because of what it symbolized: disruption, interruption, a life momentarily hijacked by ignorance. Elias had been through police stations before, of course. He'd walked precinct halls, attended justice panels, visited young defendants behind thick glass. But never like this. Never as the one being watched, judged, processed. To the officers behind the desk, he was anonymous. A man in a tailored shirt, too quiet to be trustworthy, too poised to be ordinary. They didn't recognize the name. Even after entering it into the system, no one blinked. It was as if their minds refused to register anything beyond their assumptions. The computer screen might as well have been blank. Elias had asked, politely and with clarity, for a phone call. Not just once, but 3 times over the span of 2 hours. Each time the answer came cloaked in deferral. The kind of bureaucratic shrug that said, "Not yet," when what it really meant was, "Not important." He had tried not to let it show. The tightening in his chest, the dry mouth, the sting of insult. Because Elias Dorsey knew how easily righteous indignation could be mistaken for aggression when worn by a black man in custody. So he stayed composed. Not for their comfort, but for his own protection. But the tension in the air had begun to bend around him, like metal slowly warping under pressure. Officer Harlan, the one who initiated the arrest, paced by the holding area every 10 minutes or so. Not watching, monitoring, as if waiting for the first sign of defiance. There was no empathy in his glance, only a flicker of annoyance, the kind that surfaces when people realize their assumptions might have missed something. He didn't understand Elias's stillness. It wasn't what he expected. In his worldview, the innocent stammered and the guilty raged. Elias did neither. He just waited. Calm was his weapon, patience his resistance. And that made him dangerous in ways the officer didn't know how to process. Officer Reams, the junior officer, lingered nearby more often now. She wasn't confrontational. She didn't engage. But there was something in her eyes, an unease, a questioning. She had seen something at the rest stop that her training didn't account for. Something that didn't fit the usual script. And though she hadn't spoken up, she also hadn't walked away. Her silence said more than she knew. Around Elias, the low buzz of activity never stopped. Phones rang. Radios chirped. Officers chuckled over coffee and clacked away on keyboards, as if the man sitting quietly behind the plexiglass wall was invisible. His presence barely registered. He was a background blur in their day. That, perhaps, was the most painful part. Not the handcuffs, not even the baseless search, but the indifference. Because Elias wasn't treated like a criminal, not exactly. He was treated like a placeholder. A box checked, paper shuffled. And when systems do that to a person, they don't just question your innocence, they erase your identity. A senior officer passed through the room, Sergeant Pamela Keyes. Sharp eyes, salt and pepper hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, posture like a wire hanger. She glanced toward the holding cell, then away. But Elias caught that moment. The hesitation, the flicker, the subconscious tug at something buried deeper. Still no recognition. The minutes turned to another hour. The weight of silence bore down heavier now. Elias shifted slightly on the bench, stretching one leg, then the other. The marks on his wrists still throbbed, and his hands, despite the calm posture, were starting to tremble. Not from fear, but from the immense pressure of keeping composed. The restraint of staying level when every fiber of his being knew he was being humiliated without cause. And in that moment, Elias wasn't just a judge. He was every man who had been told to sit down, wait, be patient, while the world ignored him. He carried not just his own name but the burden of those whose voices were never given weight. Every unrecorded injustice. Every time dignity was left behind in a jail cell or the back of a cruiser. Outside the station, the clouds had begun to gather, literally and figuratively. The footage from the rest stop had already been posted. A 27-second clip uploaded by a college student who had simply wanted to stretch her legs. It showed Elias, still calm, questioning, being cuffed beside his car, surrounded by suspicion he hadn't earned. That video was gaining traction by the minute. Views climbing, comments pouring in, people asking questions, demanding answers. But inside the precinct, the storm hadn't touched down yet. Elias didn't know his name was trending. He didn't know activists had already tagged every civil rights group in Michigan. That reporters were beginning to dig through court records and civic awards and board affiliations. That Judge Elias Dorsey was about to become a national headline. All he knew was the silence, the tension, the ache in his wrists and the chill in his chest. And the truth, that systems like these don't change because of yelling. They change when the consequences for ignoring dignity become too heavy to carry. And that moment was coming. The tension in the air wasn't just lingering anymore. It was waiting to snap. Outside the Jackson Police Precinct, clouds no longer just hovered. They had thickened. A low pressure had settled into the day. Unseen but undeniable. What began as a routine Tuesday was no longer routine. The city didn't know it yet, but something tectonic was shifting. And it started with a single video, filmed at a rest stop under pale spring sunlight. It had been uploaded quietly, almost casually. A 27-second clip captured from across the parking lot. A man in a slate-gray suit being handcuffed by two white officers. No yelling, no resistance, just a steady voice asking calmly, "What exactly have I done wrong?" The girl who posted it, a college junior on spring break, hadn't intended to cause a storm. She just knew what she saw didn't look right. Within an hour, the video had been shared over 10,000 times. By the second hour, it had crossed state lines, now retweeted by social justice advocates, legal scholars, and even a few local reporters. Something about it, the stillness of the man, the roughness of the officers, the bitter contrast between his composure and their suspicion, struck a collective nerve. Screenshots spread faster than commentary. Freeze frames of Elias Dorsey's face mid-arrest, of his outstretched hands, of the glint of silver on his wrist where cuffs had been too tight. Beside those images, internet sleuths had already begun piecing together who he was. And what they found wasn't a mystery. Judge Elias Dorsey, 14th District Court, 22 years of service. Member of the State Judicial Ethics Board. Former professor of constitutional law. A man who had written op-eds on the very issue of over-policing black communities. A man invited to speak that very day on judicial reform alongside the governor. The irony wasn't just bitter. It was surgical. Newsrooms lit up. Phones rang. Anchors sat a little straighter at their desks. Producers restructured the afternoon rundown. This wasn't just a viral moment. This was a story. One that tied into every thread the public was already unraveling: systemic bias, unchecked authority, appearance-based suspicion. Meanwhile, outside the Jackson precinct, people began to gather. It started with one or two. A man with a cardboard sign reading "Dignity is not probable cause," and a woman in a nursing uniform who had left her lunch break early after recognizing the judge's name from a courtroom where she once testified. But the crowd grew. By 3 p.m., dozens had arrived. By 5 o'clock, there were over 100. Students, nurses, retirees, lawyers, preachers. Some came with printed flyers. Others came in silence, holding only their presence as protest. There were no chants, no marches, not yet. Only stillness, echoing Elias's own. Inside the precinct, the shift was beginning to show. Officers who once smirked as they passed the holding cell now avoided eye contact. The atmosphere, once buzzing with procedural indifference, had quieted. Rumors began to circulate. That video? Have you seen it? Is it really him? Did we just... Sergeant Pamela Keyes was the first to sense the magnitude. She had gone back to her desk, typed the name again, this time with a bit more care, and finally read the full file. Not just the brief record logged earlier, but the judicial profile. Appointments, awards, published rulings. The kind of profile that didn't just demand respect, it carried weight. Her stomach dropped. She stood still for a long moment, staring at the screen. The pieces clicked. The name, the voice, the posture. And suddenly, the arrest wasn't just a misstep. It was a scandal waiting to detonate. Outside, a local news crew had arrived. Microphones were unboxed. Cameramen set tripods on pavement. Anchors read bulletins off their phones as they tried to confirm details. When it was verified that Judge Elias Dorsey was, in fact, being held without charge, and without his phone, the mood shifted from curiosity to outrage. Reporters tried to enter the precinct, but were met with tight-lipped statements. No comment. We're reviewing the situation. We'll release a statement when appropriate. But silence, in the face of injustice, is its own kind of confession. By evening, the hashtags had taken hold. Hashtag Judge Dorsey. Hashtag Dignity in Cuffs. Hashtag Rest Stop Profiling. Public figures joined in. Civil rights attorneys, congressional aides, even a sitting senator from Michigan who tweeted, "If even a state judge in a suit can be treated like this, what hope do our communities have?" Back in the holding area, Elias was still seated. He had seen none of the news, heard none of the protests. He didn't know that his name had become a trending topic, or that outside, strangers were holding signs with words like integrity and justice starts here. All he had was the ticking of the wall clock and the ache in his shoulders. But he knew something had changed. People began passing his holding room with a different energy now. No longer amused, no longer indifferent. They walked faster, eyes lower. The shift in energy wasn't loud, it was heavy, like the air just before a thunderstorm. Even Officer Reams, once silently complicit, now stood frozen in the hallway, arms crossed tightly, staring down at her boots. She hadn't said anything during the arrest, but she had watched the footage too. She had seen the moment she helped place cuffs on a man who had done nothing but sit still in a car that looked too expensive for someone like him. The reality of what had happened was sinking in like cold water. And the realization that people were watching, really watching, made everything feel heavier. Not just for her, for the entire building. By nightfall, the precinct's outer perimeter had been surrounded. Candles were lit. A child held up a sign that read, "What if he were your father?" No speeches were made. No chants needed. The silence was protest enough. It mirrored the same silence Elias Dorsey had kept since the moment the cuffs were placed on him. He hadn't argued. He hadn't raised his voice. And yet, the entire state now knew what had been done. Injustice didn't always scream. Sometimes it sat still. Sometimes it wore a tie. and sometimes it was filmed by a stranger just passing through. The clock on the wall ticked past 6:20 p.m., though no one seemed to be watching it. Not consciously, anyway. Yet time had become heavier inside the Jackson precinct. It moved differently now, not in steady seconds, but in anxious silences and hesitant footsteps. By then, the video had reached national platforms. Legal analysts were dissecting the incident on live TV. Cable news anchors framed the situation with growing urgency. State judge wrongfully detained by police after fitting a description. The headline blazed across a dozen outlets. Inside the station, though, change didn't roar in with alarms or loud apologies. Came slowly, subtle, like the hush that falls just before a verdict is read. Sergeant Pamela Keyes sat hunched over her desk, her reading glasses sliding to the edge of her nose. She had reread Elias Dorsey's file 5 times now, each time confirming what her gut had told her when she saw his posture, his eyes, his silence. It was him. There was no denying it anymore. Judge Elias L. Dorsey, 14th Judicial District, a name not unfamiliar to those who worked in the justice system with any integrity. He had ruled in landmark civil litigation cases, mentored dozens of clerks, and spoken at statewide criminal justice reform symposiums. Keyes had even once attended a panel where he'd addressed officers directly about procedural bias. She hadn't recognized him at first, but that wasn't surprising. Most people didn't expect to find a judge in their holding cell, and maybe that was part of the problem. Keyes stood abruptly, brushing past a handful of officers now quietly crowded around a monitor playing the arrest clip on loop. Some leaned in with folded arms, others with faces growing paler as the footage rolled again. Elias calmly speaking, hands outstretched, posture controlled, and then the snapping of cuffs, the hesitation of Reams, the decisiveness of Harlan, the power imbalance fully captured. They were no longer watching a routine stop. They were watching a mistake unfold, second by painful second. Keyes crossed the room, pushing through the thick air of unspoken guilt and confusion. She passed Officer Reams, who had pressed herself against a hallway wall, eyes wide, lips parted as if she were still searching for something to say, but couldn't find the language to match the gravity. In the holding area, Elias hadn't moved much. Still seated, still straight-backed, his jacket now resting on his lap, hands folded neatly as if waiting for a formal meeting rather than release. He wasn't tapping his foot. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't restless, because Elias Dorsey didn't need to demand respect. He already carried it. Keyes opened the door and stepped inside the holding area without preamble. Her face was stern, unreadable, but behind the tension was recognition, the kind that doesn't come from titles, but from the quiet force of character. He looked up at her with the same calm he had maintained all day, not smug, not cold, just present. She didn't ask him to explain himself. She didn't rehash the incident. Instead, she confirmed what had become clear. The institution had failed. A door somewhere deep in the station closed with a sharp click. In the main room, officers began moving with less confidence. Every report now felt like it might be the wrong one. Every step was quieter, every voice lower. The presence of that single man in their custody had become something heavier than any case they had logged that month. Because it wasn't just about who Elias was. It was about what he represented. The police system wasn't used to having power challenged in silence. Protest usually came loud signs, slogans, fists in the air. But Elias wasn't protesting. He was simply existing. And that existence, when dignified, educated, unflinching, felt more subversive to the institution than any chant ever could. It made them uncomfortable, because it reminded them that their assumptions weren't just flawed, they were dangerous. Officer Harlan, who had spent much of the afternoon walking with a puffed chest and clipped words, now sat at his terminal, staring blankly at the corner of his screen. His arrogance had crumbled into quiet panic. Because now, the consequences weren't abstract. They had a face, a reputation, a name people respected. And worse, people were watching. He heard the murmurs. He felt the glances. His ears were burning from the weight of his own decisions. Not just the arrest, but the tone, the posture, the hand that had reached too quickly for cuffs. Every micro-decision was now under a microscope. He tried, weakly, to justify it in his mind. He didn't say who he was. He could have de-escalated. He could have explained better. But the truth was simpler. He hadn't asked. Because he hadn't cared. Reams, meanwhile, had retreated to a side room. Alone, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her reflection in the one-way glass didn't look like the officer she'd imagined herself to be. The remorse had started the moment she'd fastened the second cuff. But now it weighed like concrete. She hadn't spoken up. She had followed her partner's lead. And now, silence felt as loud as the clinking of those cuffs had sounded hours earlier. Back in the holding room, Keyes returned with a phone and handed it to Elias without comment. The expression on her face wasn't pity. It was accountability. The kind that rarely makes headlines but matters most in the quiet rooms of failing systems. Elias accepted it with a nod. Not a thank you, not yet. Because courtesy could not erase what had been done. But it was a step. The crowd outside had grown. Candles now dotted the sidewalk. Volunteers were distributing water bottles. Someone had brought a Bluetooth speaker and played a quiet version of "A Change Is Gonna Come." Reporters huddled under tents, whispering updates and watching the doors with relentless attention. The precinct had become a glass house. And inside it, Judge Elias Dorsey had begun to stand. Not with volume, but with truth. The shift was underway. Not because he demanded power, but because power, when misused, collapses under the weight of quiet, steady dignity. The moment didn't announce itself with thunder. There was no sudden boom, no slammed door, no dramatic outburst. It arrived quietly, like most truths do, but it shifted the room in an instant. Sergeant Pamela Keyes had spent the last hour coordinating calls with the governor's legal counsel, internal affairs, and the state attorney general's office. Her voice, sharp and measured, carried a different weight now. Everyone around her had noticed the change. In her tone, her posture, her urgency. Something had cracked open. Word had finally reached the top. The governor's staff confirmed what social media had already made viral. The man sitting in their holding room was not just any state official. He wasn't just a respected judge. He was one of the state's foremost voices on law enforcement reform. A key figure expected to co-lead a judiciary roundtable that was meant to begin that very morning. And now he was trending. Not for his achievements. Not for his rulings. But because someone looked at his skin, his car, and his stillness and saw a threat. Pamela moved with purpose, her boots clacking sharply down the hallway as she headed toward the holding room. But this time, she wasn't walking as a gatekeeper. She was walking to correct something that had already gone too far. Inside, Elias had remained calm as always. Not detached, just measured. His body had been still for hours, but his mind hadn't stopped. The irony was not lost on him. He had dedicated decades to protecting the system's integrity. And now he was sitting quietly in a corner of that very system's basement, treated like a threat to it. But this wasn't unfamiliar ground. He had seen this before, in courtroom testimonies, in police reports, in the tearful recountings of young men whose names were never trending. The difference was that this time, the man in the chair wore a title the world finally cared about. A robe the headlines found interesting, but the fear, the profiling, the humiliating restraint, that was shared. So when the door opened and Sergeant Keyes entered, something shifted. Not in Elias, but in the air around him. The way her shoulders moved, the way her eyes didn't dart, didn't narrow. They held a look Elias hadn't seen all day. Recognition, not just of identity, but of truth. She spoke to him carefully. Not with pity, not with apology, but with the firm, procedural tone of someone who finally understood the stakes. She addressed him properly, acknowledged the title, referred to the events of the morning as a grave procedural failure. There were no excuses, no rationalizations. Not anymore. Outside, the crowd had reached critical mass. The precinct was surrounded. News crews were streaming live from the sidewalk. Legal observers had arrived, notebooks in hand. Ministers and local lawmakers began stepping through the crowd, weaving between protest signs that read, "Justice can't wear handcuffs," and "Judged without justice." Inside the briefing room, Officer Travis Harlan sat in stunned silence. He had finally watched the video in full. Not just the body cam, but the cell phone footage, the angle from across the rest stop. He watched the frame where Elias stood, calm, hands visible, asking plainly for clarification. He watched the moment he had reached into the man's car without consent, watched himself dismiss every calm, clear sentence with suspicion. And then the scroll of online headlines followed. Breaking: Judge Elias Dorsey wrongfully detained by state troopers en route to Reform Summit. The headlines didn't feel real. The comments were worse. Thousands of people tagging state offices, calling for suspensions, investigations, firings. His name, Harlan, was trending too, but not in celebration. He turned away from the screen, nausea creeping in beneath his ribs. The badge on his chest, which had always brought him comfort, now felt heavier, as if it carried more than authority, as if it carried accusation. He didn't speak. There was nothing he could say. Officer Reams stood near the break room doorway, arms crossed tightly, her eyes rimmed red from tears she hadn't let fall in front of anyone. The weight of complicity pressed into her chest like a dull blade. She hadn't cuffed the man first. She hadn't initiated the stop. But she had followed. She had watched the lines being crossed and had said nothing. That silence echoed now. In every footstep, every glance from her fellow officers, every clipped conversation behind closed doors. The institution had turned inward, and she knew this was going to follow her for the rest of her career, maybe her life. Down the hall, Sergeant Keyes escorted Elias toward the conference room. Not in handcuffs, not in shame, with measured reverence. He had made no demands, had not threatened lawsuits or media exposure. And yet, every person he passed stepped aside. Some nodded in silence. Others lowered their gaze. Power had shifted not because he took it, but because dignity, when preserved under pressure, demands acknowledgement. In the makeshift press room, hastily arranged with microphones and state officials scrambling for damage control, Elias was finally seated with his peers. The same officials he was meant to meet with hours earlier now surrounded him with uneasy silence. The governor's liaison offered an apology. So did the state attorney's office. But Elias didn't respond right away. He allowed the room to feel its discomfort, let it sit in the truth of what had happened. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't waver. He didn't offer drama. He didn't perform outrage. He simply explained what he had experienced. The moment he had been profiled. The moment his credentials hadn't mattered. The moment his skin alone decided how the system would treat him. He reminded them all that if he, a judge, could be treated that way with cameras rolling, imagine what happened to those without a platform, without an audience, without a title. And that was the moment the governor's staff made a decision that would stun the state. The disciplinary hearing for the officers involved, both Harlan and Reams, would be reviewed immediately. And the man appointed to lead the impartial panel? Judge Elias Dorsey. There was protest at first, from procedural watchdogs, internal counsel, some state police advocates, but the governor's office stood firm. There was no conflict of interest, only accountability. And no one more qualified to lead that hearing than the man who had lived it with grace. The twist was not announced with a dramatic sting. It was delivered plainly, but its impact rippled outward like an earthquake. The institution had tried to strip a man of his dignity, and now that same man would decide its fate. Spring arrived late that year in Michigan, as if the world itself had paused to exhale after the storm. Trees bloomed slowly along courthouse avenues, their pink blossoms clinging to the chill as the city stirred beneath a different rhythm. What had started as a single wrongful arrest at a quiet rest stop had, within weeks, become something larger, something structural. Change, people had often said, comes slowly. But this time it had come with urgency. Not because the system had suddenly grown a conscience, but because it had been exposed in high definition. On every screen, in every headline, in every conversation whispered across breakroom tables, barbershops, courtroom corridors, and statehouse stairs. The image of Judge Elias Dorsey, sitting calmly in the back of a squad car, handcuffed for nothing more than fitting a stereotype, had become emblematic. Not of his status, but of the system's sickness. Because if it could happen to him, then who among them was truly safe? The governor's office, under mounting pressure, launched a full statewide review of police training and conduct. What began as a press release had turned into a movement. Public reckoning. An unflinching audit of behavior long buried under procedure and paperwork. Mandatory de-escalation training was rolled out across all counties. Bias recognition modules, once optional, often skipped, were now enforced with real consequences. The Law Enforcement Academy curriculum was overhauled. Constitutional rights weren't just theory anymore, they were tested, measured, watched. Cadets were evaluated not just on physical readiness, but on ethical resilience. For the first time in state history, a civilian oversight committee was formed, independent, diverse, and given real authority. Not just to review complaints, but to recommend disciplinary action, escalate investigations, and mandate reform. And woven through it all, from legislation to lecture halls, was the story of one man. Not his title, not his viral video, but his restraint. Judge Elias Dorsey had not filed lawsuits. He hadn't toured newsrooms or spoken on daytime talk shows. He declined interviews, declined political platforms. He understood what many did not, that real change doesn't always happen in front of cameras. Sometimes it happens in silence, in policy drafts, in uncomfortable board meetings where people are finally forced to listen. He had returned to his courtroom quietly, not once referencing the incident unless asked to by his peers behind closed doors. There was no bitterness in him, but there was resolve, the kind of resolve that seeps into every word, every ruling, every glance from the bench. Defendants who entered his courtroom now looked at him differently. Not because of what happened, but because of how he endured it. His authority had always been respected, but now it was lived, visible, tactile. Proof that even the robed were not immune to the stain of injustice. Months passed. Investigations unfolded. Officer Travis Harlan was terminated following the broader inquiry. His records revealed a pattern. Small incidents, dismissed complaints, behavioral notes quietly filed away. Things that, individually, hadn't been enough to spark reform. Together, they painted a portrait of unchecked authority. Officer Reams, after disciplinary leave, chose to resign. She left a letter behind, handwritten, brief, raw. It wasn't a justification. It was an acknowledgement, a fear, of silence, of the cost of going along. That letter was read aloud in one of the first training sessions under the state's new reform program. Not to shame, but to teach. And across the state, in training rooms and precincts, Elias's story lived on. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a turning point. 3 months after the hearing, on a breezy April morning, Elias Dorsey stood at the front steps of the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy. He wore no robe, no badge, no microphone. Just a crisp blue suit and a leather notebook in hand. Before him stood a graduating class of 52 cadets, the first trained under the newly passed standards. They stood in formation, not rigidly, not with blind pride, but with an awareness that hadn't existed before. Each cadet had watched the video, had read the transcripts, had sat through simulations not just of active threats but of quiet prejudice, the kind that wears a smile and assumes too much. Elias addressed them, not with grand oratory, but with sincerity. He spoke about dignity, about restraint, about the quiet power of accountability. He didn't lecture. He didn't warn. He reminded that they would have authority, but with it responsibility, and that trust was not given by a badge, it was earned by behavior. When he finished, the cadets didn't applaud. They nodded. Some swallowed hard. A few blinked away emotion they hadn't expected to feel, because the man before them wasn't just a judge. He was a mirror of what the system had been, and what maybe it could still become. Afterward, as families reunited with the cadets and flash photos filled the training field, one young black recruit approached him. He didn't speak long, just thanked him, not just for surviving what had happened, but for not letting it sour the soil they were meant to plant something new in. Elias nodded, told him to serve with integrity, and walked back toward the marble steps, alone, but never truly so again, because what had happened to him had stirred something that couldn't be undone. Town halls across the state saw record attendance. Communities began to trust again, not blindly but cautiously, through small wins. Police chiefs were replaced. Prosecutors held meetings with clergy. Laws were reviewed with real transparency. Justice, once a word carved above doors, was now becoming something living. Not perfect, but breathing. And as Elias Dorsey stood in the spring wind, coat flapping slightly at his sides, he allowed himself, for the first time in a while, a moment of hope. Not because the fight was over, but because it had finally begun in earnest. Because sometimes change doesn't start with a riot or a revolution. Sometimes it begins with a man who doesn't raise his voice, who just refuses to lower his dignity. If the story moved you, if it made you think, if it stirred something deep within you about what justice really means, comment below and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Share this story with someone who still believes change is possible. Because real accountability doesn't come from noise. It comes from not staying silent when it matters most. And in the end, justice doesn't wear a badge or a robe. It wears us in the choices we make and the standards we defend. Every single day.